What's love got to do with it? Thank you. Wow. That's exactly what I was looking for. That's what you've been watching for 5 weeks now, right? In the bumper, it said, what's love got to do with it? Everything. It's got everything. If you look at the Bible, love's got everything to do with everything. It's what Jesus was all about. It's who God is. By very character, God is love. That's what the Bible tells us in 1 John. And Jesus exemplifies it better than anybody else. Being God in flesh, he shows us, he puts skin on what love looks like. And so what we've been doing in this series is we've been looking at 1 Corinthians, which is 1 Corinthians 13, which is referred to as a love chapter because Paul talks about love in there. And so we've been looking at an attribute of love in 1 Corinthians 13, and then we've been looking at the life of Jesus and seeing how he put that into practice. And today, last week we talked about how love isn't me first, right? Love is others first. We've talked about in this series how love is patient. And if you want to love, it looks like kindness. If you want to look like God, then in his love, it's not, your love isn't envious or boastful or arrogant or rude or self-seeking. Today, what we're going to look for and the truth we're going to see about love today is found here. If I can get this to move. It doesn't want to move today. In 1 Corinthians 13, verse 6, it says, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. So what we're going to talk about today is that love tells the truth. Now, when we say that, right, when I say love tells the truth, some of us, I'll throw myself in there, some of us we'd consider ourselves truth people. And we get kind of excited for this one because it's like, all right, this has all been nice. Love is kind and patient and all that stuff. But let's get to the heart. Love tells the truth. All right, I'm ready. Let's go, right? Because this is the one that we think that's like, okay, now this is going to give us this excuse to go lambaste people and say, well, love tells the truth. You've been around those people that says something incredibly mean and incredibly rude, and then they say, well, it's the truth, right? And you're like, oh, well, now I feel so loving. I feel so much more like, I'm just glad that you added that in there because now it's no longer rude because you just said, well, it's the truth. Here's what we're going to learn about this. Love, although love tells the truth, love doesn't weaponize the truth. Love never uses truth as a weapon. And here's the thing. If it doesn't fit in with what we've been learning in this series all along, right? So you may tell the truth, but if that truth isn't also patient and kind and not boastful or proud or rude, then it's not love. Call it what you want, but it's not love. So we're going to see Jesus today and how he navigates through what it looks like to tell the truth. And the principle we're learning is that love, that there's things about love, there's verse that our hearts rejoice in. What thrills our hearts, what makes us happy, what makes us glad, that's what we're talking about. And so Paul talks about the negative side first when he says, and you can write this in if you have your sermon notes, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing. Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing. It doesn't take any pleasure in sin, essentially. In the context of love, what Paul's getting at here is that if we say that we are loving people, if we want to love the way Jesus loves, then if something goes wrong, if there's sin happening, if wrongdoing is going on, if iniquity is happening, if somebody that we've been struggling with runs into a hard time, when somebody that we haven't really had the best relationship, when something goes wrong in their life, what love doesn't do is be happy. And at first glance, right, we're like, well, of course, right? But this is where I find in my life, right, as I looked at this is where I found some conviction. Because if we put words to kind of what our soul feels at times, when things go wrong for people that we are in conflict with, sometimes it's a heart check to say, man, I'm not going to rejoice that something's going wrong. Even though it's the truth, but I'm not going to rejoice in that. Love causes us to be patient with others and causes us to be kind, and it doesn't allow us to continue, and it also doesn't rejoice when things are going wrong. I love some of these commentators have, and other like paraphrases have said this: love is never glad when others go wrong. And I like this one: love doesn't gloat over the wickedness of other people. This concept of rejoicing in the misfortunes of others, man, that's what governs what we watch on TV. Like, that's what the news is, right? Man, the news loves a good story about something going wrong, doesn't it? Like, news anchors, they rejoice in wrongdoing because it's like, well, there's ratings right there. If it bleeds, it sells. Right? If it bleeds, it gets ratings. If there's drama in it, it gives ratings, right? And so everybody, like if you watch the news still, which, my opinion, I hope you don't, because I think you'll be happier in life if you don't. But if you do, if you continue to watch the news, or if you meander yourself through social media and you see the news or your phone, man, your phone just loves to tell you, loves to tell you everybody in the world that's dying these days, right? In their phone notification, like every day, it's like some other celebrity died and I needed to know about it, apparently, right? And they just want to get you all these clickbait things, right? All of that, all of media is like the opposite of what the Bible says here, because they rejoice in wrongdoing. And sometimes, depending on your personality, we get kind of caught into that, right? We get kind of sucked into that vortex where we're like, oh, I want to hear the latest juicy gossip. I want to hear the latest thing that's happening to these people. Ooh, they deserve it. Because they're so, these people, whoever these people are in your life, those people that drive you crazy, that group that you've kind of clustered everybody in, and then you see something go wrong with these people. When we see the news story about that, we have to check our hearts, because sometimes our hearts go, ooh, well, they're finally getting what they deserve. They're finally, and then the sad and the sick part is that sometimes we say, well, it's the truth, but it's not loving. And what God says love doesn't do, love doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing. Why do we do this, right? Maybe this hits you like it hit me this week. But here's why I think we rejoice in wrongdoing. Sometimes somebody else's mistake benefits you. And so we kind of rejoice because somebody else's mistake, somebody else's failure, it benefited you. This started, I don't know if you've noticed this. This started real young when I was coaching my son in baseball. Like 5 years old. And my son was good. Like he had really good hand-eye coordination. So he learned really quick. Like he could just slap the ball. Didn't hit for power, but man, he could slap the ball anywhere he wanted to. And so what he would do, he figured this out all on his own. I didn't even coach them this. I promise, I didn't coach him this. He would at 6 years old, he's like, well, if I hit it to the third baseman, there's no way he can make that throw across. So he just, the third baseman, make it on first every time, because that little third baseman, if he actually managed to field it cleanly, there's no way he threw it on target. And so, and then as he grew up, right, even when he was 9, 10, 11 years old, he would hit the ball on the ground, and where normally, like in adult baseball, he would be out because the guy would field it, throw him out, right? But the first baseman couldn't catch. And so here's what we did. We taught teach everybody by the way that we cheer, right? Because somebody else's failure meant that my son was on first base. And so he would hit it, somebody else would make an error, we'd go, yeah, good job. I'm glad that kid sucked, because now my son's standing on first, because somebody else's mistake was beneficial. Yay. And we reinforce this, right? I'm not the only one. You all sit at the games too. You're like, yeah, he made it on first because that kid couldn't, was picking his nose and the ball went between his legs. Who's that kid's parents, right? And they're like, that's my kid. Yeah. Right? So sometimes, and unfortunately, we don't grow up from that. So sometimes when we're at work and some of your coworkers make a mistake, it's going to benefit you because you're going to look better in the eyes of your boss. And we have a little struggle with in our attitude of not saying, man, sure, I'm glad he made that mistake because now I look better. But love doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing. With your siblings, we know this happens, right? When your sibling would screw up, and all of a sudden you're like, yeah, your sibling's having a terrible attitude. And you're like, Mommy, Daddy, I love you. Is there anything? You start sucking up. I know. I did it. I see my kids do it, right? Because a little part of us rejoices when somebody else screws up because that means that we look a little bit better. But that's not what the Bible says love does. Sometimes we rejoice in the sins of others because it gives us a feeling of spiritual superiority. This is what the Pharisees did all the time with the people in the Bible. We see Jesus condemn it all the time. The Pharisees would walk around and they'd be like, well, I might have issues, but I ain't like them scumbags, right? At least I'm not doing that. And so it allows us to walk around. And I was talking to our youth group, or some of our students about this last night, that is called the comparison trap, right? And the danger of the comparison trap is this: you will always find somebody who is doing it better than you, and you'll always find somebody doing worse than you. And you'll either feel superior because somebody else is doing it worse than you, or you'll feel inferior because somebody's doing better than you, and it's a trap. And it's a trap because love doesn't rejoice when something goes wrong for somebody else. Sometimes we rejoice in others' mistakes and misfortunes because of resentment we harbor against them. That's what I talked about a minute ago, right? That person that you are in conflict with, the person that you see as maybe an enemy or somebody that you don't particularly like. And when something goes wrong for them, because we're harboring bitterness against them in our hearts and we haven't let go of that and we haven't forgiven that, then we get excited when something goes wrong. Sometimes we rejoice in the sins of others because it gives us an excuse to do the same thing. Like, well, at least, hey, you ever see some other Christian that you see, and they're doing something, you're like, well, I guess I can do that because they're doing it. And so we get a little, but that's not what love does. That's what the whole point of this. And I know that sometimes bringing those things out, like giving words to what we feel in our heart and our soul sometimes is ugly. Right? And some of us would never admit that we rejoice at somebody else's wrongdoing. But I think it's a good heart check that Paul puts in 1 Corinthians when he says, love doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing, but the opposite, it rejoices in truth. Love rejoices with the truth. Eugene Peterson's paraphrases it this way: love doesn't revel when others grovel, but takes pleasure in the flowering of truth. So when we say love tells the truth, that's what we're talking about today. What we're really, the bottom line of what we're talking about is that love doesn't just not rejoice in wrongdoing, but it rejoices when truth abounds. And because we know that God is truth, that God holds truth, that God reveals truth, that whenever truth comes to the surface, whenever truth abounds, there's rejoicing that should take place. Whether or not that affects you or not, negatively or positively, that we become a people like Jesus who just rejoices when truth abounds, when God's truth comes to fruition in life, when we see goodness, when we see truth, when we see God's word taking root in somebody's life, when we see somebody turning from sin and finding salvation, when we see somebody who was lost, found, when we see those things, that our hearts move towards rejoicing because truth is there, because God is there. That's what Paul's getting at when he says in 1 Corinthians to the church that love tells the truth. Not, hey guys, weaponize the truth and just go tell people off, because obviously love tells the truth. So it gives you a right just to go be a jerk to everybody and then couch it with say, well, it's the truth. Get over it. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying love rejoices when truth abounds. In the Bible, in Luke chapter 15, which is where we're going to spend the remainder of our time, and I've got to move. Holy cow. I spent way too long in that. Let's get to it. Luke 15, okay? Luke 15, Jesus tells three parables about rejoicing and rejoicing at truth. And it starts out this way, like most of these things. Now, tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to Jesus to hear him preach. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So here's what we have happening, right? We have tax collectors and sinners, which for the religious elite of the day thought those guys were just scum of the earth. They didn't even deserve, not only did they rejoice in their wrongdoing because it made them feel better, but they were like, you guys are just stay out there, right? But Jesus welcomed these people. If we read through the Gospels, he approves through the Gospels, Jesus loved spending time around a table, eating dinners with tax collectors and sinners. And so those kind of people loved Jesus, and they flocked around Jesus. The Pharisees were irritated because they wanted Jesus to love them. And so they were trying to point out all these things because they rejoiced in wrongdoing. That's what the Pharisees did. They were experts at rejoicing in wrongdoing. So Jesus tells three parables about rejoicing when he tells a story about a lost sheep. He tells a story about a lost coin that was found. And then the parable we're going to focus on is that of a lost son. And you guys may have heard this story before. I'm guessing that many of you have heard this story before. We've preached this story before, but I want to take a look at it from a little bit different angle today, in this context of rejoicing in the truth. And we already are off to a rough start because this is called, you guys know the story as what? The prodigal son, right? The prodigal son. But really, this isn't a story about one son. This is a story about two sons. This is a story about two prodigal sons. One just didn't go anywhere, and the other one did. Let's jump into the story. And today we're going to focus a little bit. We're going to read through the whole story, but we're going to focus more at the end. It says this, and he said to them, Jesus said, there was a man who had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me a share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. We'll pause right there. The younger son essentially comes and says, I want my share of the inheritance. Now, this would have been essentially saying to his dad, I want you, I wish that you weren't alive anymore. I wish that you were dead so that I could get my inheritance money. And what's even crazier about this story is that his father did that. Now, he comes to that, maybe for some of you, you imagine being a young person going up to your dad, saying this? You would have either probably gotten yelled at, maybe, took a backhand, right? Essentially said, hey, I kind of wish you were dead. You just give me the stuff that you're going to give me if you were dead. Essentially what he said is, I want your stuff, but I don't want you. This is so crazy unacceptable, especially, it's crazy unacceptable in our culture today, but back in that culture, it was even worse. They couldn't even fathom this, right? Because of the respect that they would have. What's interesting in that time is that because the father had two sons, the inheritance would have been divided in three ways. The older son would have gotten 2/3 of the inheritance, and the younger son would have gotten 1/3. It wasn't a fair system, but that's the system they had. And so the father does it. And interesting in the Greek, the word that he says here that he divided divided his share. It's not the word inheritance or property, estate. It's the Greek word is bios, from which we get biology. In other words, the father divided his life between his two sons. Everything the father had, the younger son was asking to tear, essentially for the father to tear his life apart and give him what he owed. And the father does it. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took off on a journey to a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in the country. And he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. For this Jewish boy, he had hit rock bottom. He was even tending pigs and wanted to eat pig slop. He hits rock bottom. He's down to the very end of his life, essentially, by his own merit, by his own choices. How many people are there in life? Maybe not you in this room, but we see them, right? People in rock bottom situations. And sometimes those are the people that we have to check our hearts to not rejoice in their suffering, to not rejoice. Because, they did it to themselves, right? He did it to himself. He was irresponsible. And sometimes our hearts rejoice in this. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, and I perish here in hunger? I will arise and go into my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. Throughout this series, we've been talking a lot about Jesus and his view towards lost and broken and hurting people. And this shows up again. Often the word compassion comes up. And he felt compassion, and he ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, the speech that he's been practicing, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put on a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and notice this is important, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this, my son, was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and he's found. And they began to celebrate. Man, the son realized how foolish he was. And so he hatched this plan to come back as a servant, because a servant was being treated better than he was. And so he came back, he had practiced all this, but it says that a couple interesting things in this. First, it says the father saw him from a long distance off, indicating he was keeping an eye out. Against all hope, he was keeping an eye out. Against what anybody else would have advised, he was keeping an eye out for his son. And then it says when he saw him a long way off, he ran. He ran. Now, kids ran in that day. Youth ran in that day. Women would run in that day, but not fathers. In that culture, fathers didn't run, because to run in that day with what they were wearing means that they would have to, they would wear these long robes, and that means they would have to kind of hike up their robe to be able to run, and that was incredibly undignified. And so fathers, men especially, and especially wealthy men, never ran. And yet Jesus in this story is painting this picture of a father who runs. When we would think, right, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the people listening to the story, they would think that this story would come with this son coming back And the father turning his back on the son, and the son then pleading to be a servant, and without barely turning around, the father would say, well, you don't even deserve that, but I guess you could be a servant. That's what they were expecting. Because in their context, that son was getting what he deserved. More so, they would have probably celebrated even more. They would have probably rejoiced more if the story ended from Jesus with saying the father said, you're dead to me. You wanted me dead, now you're dead. Get out of here. You don't get any more. Here's the deal. If Jesus would have said that to the Pharisees, all the Pharisees would have said, great story, Jesus. That's what he deserved. Good. But that's not what happened. And much to the horror of the Pharisees, the horror of those of us who love to think, those of us who think we love justice, to the horror of those of us who struggle with rejoicing in wrongdoing. Jesus talks about a father who runs. And he doesn't hear any of this pre-planned speech that the son gives. Instead, he just says, get the best robe. Get the ring. Get him cleaned up. He's been with pigs after all. And then he said, cover him. In other words, cover this guy's nakedness, his shame. Remember, he lost everything. It was likely this kid was walking back with nothing. No clothes on his back, nothing. Dirty from head to toe, in stinky pig slop. And the father covers his nakedness because he is rejoicing. Notice what he says, where it's time to celebrate and be glad. It's time to celebrate and be glad and eat. For my son was dead and now he's alive. He's talking about rejoicing in the truth. And although it doesn't seem like this is kind of one of those Jesus moments where he just reverses everything for the people listening, and for us even today, like we gotta strip away kind of our preconceived notion of this story. Jesus is trying to say to us, listen, this is a completely upside down thing, because in this moment when the father does this, he's rejoicing in truth. What? No, he's letting his son off the hook. No, Jesus is saying this parable. He's saying, no, I'm rejoicing in truth. It's completely upside down, and the older son is having nothing of it. Remember, this is a story about two sons. Now, the older son was in the field, and as he came, he drew near to the house. He heard the music and the dancing. And he called out to one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he had received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and he entreated him, but he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat, even a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, he can't even call him his brother, this son of yours, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. And he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It's fitting to celebrate and be glad, for your brother was dead and he's alive. He was lost. Now he's found. What was the brother most concerned about? The calf. The dumb cow. Right? You notice that in the story? I didn't notice that until this week. That what the brother was most concerned about in this story was he's like, listen, the servant came out, what's going on? Your brother's home, and your father is celebrating, and he killed the fatted calf. He killed the calf? He killed the goat? All right, the goat, the cow? What he says is, when the father comes down, he's like, listen, you didn't even give me a goat. And we all know, I've had goat and I've had cow. Goat's not bad, friends, but cow is better. And he's like, I've been here this whole time. Notice the language he uses though, right? He says, you never given me anything like that, not even a goat, let alone the calf. In other words, what the older son is saying, how dare you use your wealth like that? How dare you? He disobeyed you. I've obeyed you this whole time, but you didn't consult me about this decision. I have rights. Remember, he's not wrong in saying the words he's saying. He's saying what's technically true. He had all the right to say, well, it's true. Right? Because remember, the father divided. He gave his inheritance to the youngest son. He also gave his inheritance to the older son. The older son owned everything that was there. And that's what he's ticked off about. He's like, that you gave the young cat, that's my cow. That's part of my inheritance. And I've been in the field serving, and this idiot brother of mine, he didn't even call him his brother, this idiot son of yours, squandered his, and now he wants to come back. He was factually true. But what I say to my kids all the time, you can be factually true and 1,000,000% wrong all at the same time. And that's what this brother was. That's what Jesus is showing. And Jesus is trying to flip this all around. That's why he says here, he says, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. He's saying this is, but yet it's fitting for us to celebrate because his son was lost. He's saying, he went out to his older son. He said, I want you to party with us. I want you to come, even though you've disrespected me, you've disregarded me. Essentially, the older brother didn't treat the father any better than the younger son did. He didn't. He was still using his father for his wealth, just like the younger son. See, the younger son gives us a really clear picture of what sin looks like. No one can deny that, right? Everybody can agree he's a sinner. The tables are turned in this story because the older son, who thought he was very good, and the younger son was thought to be the bad one, especially in the eyes of all the people hearing, yet they were both estranged from their father, because they didn't understand the heart of their father. Both of them used their father to get what they wanted. They didn't really love him. They used him for his status, his wealth. Interesting though, the bad son is the one who is saved in this story, and the good one is the one who is lost. It's this complete, like Jesus does often, this complete role reversal in his stories. And he takes these Pharisees who had prided themselves on being the good ones, the truth tellers, the keepers of truth. He said, you're not loving it all. And you're not even keeping the truth that I want you to keep. Because the truth I want you to keep is this, that we celebrate and we rejoice in what God says we rejoice in. And that's when lost people are found. That's when the truth is prized. That is when somebody's heart moves towards the Lord. That is when somebody who is broken and hurting begins taking steps towards the Lord to come back. That's the truth that we celebrate. Once was lost is now found. And here's where it rubs us all. Because no matter whether you're in here today and you feel like your life has looked a lot more like the younger son, or if you're in here today and sadly, if we're just kind of honest in our hearts, like I have to be, we identify with the older son. The gospel truth is both offensive to the morally and righteous people as well as sinners and lost people. Because what Jesus does, he flips this whole thing around. And we realize that this is exactly what Jesus did for us. You see, the younger son could only be brought back into the family at the cost of the older son. It wasn't free. Remember, the older son, he had all the 2/3 of the rest of the inheritance. The older son has to pay. Like, this is his stuff. That was his cow. That was his stuff that was being used to party with, to celebrate with. And a true older son would have seen his father's pain. A true older son would have went out and looked for, he would have beat his father out there looking for his lost brother. He would have welcomed him home. Man, doesn't this kind of love seem impossible? Like, if we're honest, right? Like, sometimes we just, sometimes we have to realize that love just costs a lot. And to love like Jesus costs a lot. Because we would much rather take the simple way out of just kind of telling people off. And like, well, you deserve that. I'm so glad that we have a God that when we were lost and far off, and we were sitting in the pig slop of life, and we decided, somewhere along the line, and maybe this is some of your story that you hear today, and somewhere along the line, you decided, like, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of this pain. I'm tired of this addiction. I'm tired of this brokenness. I've tried it all. I'm so glad that when we decided to come back, and maybe even some of you have rehearsed speeches where you said, God, I'm gonna come back to you, but I'm gonna serve you. I promise. I'll give my, I'll go. Listen, if you want me to, I'll go to Africa, okay? And I'll serve you there, and I'll go, and we've just planned these speeches like the younger son. I promise I won't, God, if you take me back this time, I promise I won't look at that again, or I promise I won't put that in my body again, or I promise I will give it up. I promise this time. And guess what? God is completely uninterested in your comeback speech. Because you have a God that runs to you. And you're lost. When you were lost in your brokenness, you have a God who runs. And he throws his arms around you, and he wants to throw a party. Because what God values, what truth says, love rejoices in truth. And friends, there is no greater truth to rejoice in than when lost are found. That's worth celebrating. And Jesus was consistent with this message over and over and over through the Gospels. What he values most is sometimes, sadly, if you have older brother syndrome, who we disregard because they deserve it. I'm so thankful we don't have a God that did that to me when I was lost and I'm broken. And so we take that, and if we want to be a people who love like God loves, we won't rejoice when wrong things happen. We won't rejoice in the suffering of other people. We won't rejoice when, even if it puts us ahead, if we want to be people who love like God, we will rejoice with the truth. We will rejoice when truth is brought to the surface. We will rejoice when lost people are found. And we will even partner with God. We will become the older brothers who didn't do like the son in this story, but we will go and we will run and we will find those who are lost. You notice Jesus never finishes this story. We don't know if the brother went into the party or not. We don't know what the response was from the older brother after having this conversation. And I think Jesus purposely left it that way. Because I think it's for you and I to decide how we're going to respond. I think it's for us to figure out. Because in so many ways and in so many, more than we'd like to admit, we are the older brothers. And God is inviting us to celebrate and rejoice in truth. I want you to process just maybe what that looks like in your life. Who are those people that maybe you've written off? You've rejoiced at their wrongdoing. You've said they're too far gone. Love doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing, but it always rejoices when truth abounds.